The Nevada desert was vast, stretching out like an endless sea of sand and rock under the blazing sun. For Tom Carter, this isolation was freedom. After years of military service, he had found solace in the quiet brutality of the desert. The stillness, however, was shattered one afternoon when a fiery object streaked across the sky, crashing somewhere beyond the horizon. Tom had seen meteor showers, but this was different. The trajectory was too controlled, too deliberate. Curiosity got the better of him, and he revved his off-road bike, speeding toward the plume of smoke that had begun rising in the distance. When he arrived, the scene before him was surreal. A small spacecraft lay in a crater, its hull glowing hot, twisted metal and alien technology scattered across the desert floor. Tom's instincts told him to leave. This was above his pay grade, dangerous. But as he scanned the wreckage, he saw her. An alien woman, crumpled and barely moving, lay among the wreckage. Her silver skin shimmered faintly, though it was marred by deep, glowing wounds that pulsed weakly. She was clearly in pain, her breath shallow and uneven. Tom hesitated. This was no ordinary encounter, and whatever she was, helping her could bring a world of trouble. But something in her fragile state stirred something inside him, a call to act. Against his better judgment, he made his way down into the crater, carefully stepping over the debris. He knelt beside her, assessing the damage. She was barely conscious, her eyes flickering open only to close again in exhaustion. The heat from the crash made it difficult to breathe, and Tom knew he had to move quickly. He wasn't sure how to help an alien, but he couldn't just leave her here to die. "Come on," Tom muttered, lifting her gently, surprised at how light she felt in his arms. Her body was limp, barely responsive, but he could feel the faint beat of life still within her. With as much care as he could manage, Tom carried her to his bike, shielding her from the harsh sun with his jacket. He glanced back at the crash site, wondering who or what might come looking for her. Then, without another thought, he sped off into the desert, racing against time and the unknown. Tom's camp was a small, rugged setup nestled between rocky outcrops far from any civilization. As he arrived, he carefully laid the alien woman on a cot inside his tent, her body still motionless, her breathing shallow. He grabbed his med kit, though he wasn't sure how much good it would do. Her wounds were unlike anything he'd seen before, deep, glowing lacerations that seemed almost alive. Her skin, silver and reflective, was cold to the touch. Tom pulled out his water canteen and gently dribbled some over her lips. To his surprise, she responded with a faint stir, her lips parting slightly to take in the water. It was a small sign, but it gave him hope. "Hang in there," Tom muttered, working quickly to clean the wounds with antiseptic. He wasn't sure if human medicine would work, but he didn't have any other options. He wrapped her wounds with gauze, trying to stop the strange glowing fluid from seeping out. As he worked, her eyes fluttered open for a brief moment, her gaze locking with his. There was a flash of recognition and then pain. Her lips moved, but no words came out, just a faint whisper of breath. She was too weak to speak, but Tom could see the desperation in her eyes. She was scared. "You're going to be okay," Tom said softly, though he wasn't sure if that was true. He was flying blind, and for all he knew, she was beyond saving. Hours passed, and as the sun set, casting long shadows across the desert, Tom sat beside her, watching over her as she slipped in and out of consciousness. Her breathing had steadied, but she was still dangerously weak. He couldn't help but wonder who she was and why she had crashed here. More importantly, he wondered what kind of trouble this would bring. As night fell, the desert grew cold, and Tom wrapped a blanket around her, keeping her warm. His mind raced with possibilities. Was she a soldier, a fugitive, royalty? Whatever her story was, it was clear that she had been abandoned, left to die in the middle of nowhere. And now, for better or worse, Tom had made the choice to save her. He didn't know what lay ahead, but he wasn't going to turn back now. As the stars spread across the sky, Tom leaned back in his chair, keeping watch over the alien woman as she slept. There was no going back. Not now. In the silence of the desert night, two worlds had collided, and their fates were now intertwined. The morning sun crept over the desert horizon, casting its golden light on the makeshift shelter where Tom kept a silent vigil over the wounded alien princess. She hadn't moved much through the night, though her breathing had steadied, and the strange glow from her wounds had dimmed. It was a tentative sign of healing, though Tom wasn't sure how long it would last. As he prepared a simple breakfast of canned beans and stale coffee, a sound from behind him made him freeze. The soft rustling of fabric. She was waking. Tom turned just in time to see her eyes flutter open. They were unlike any he had ever seen, a deep violet hue with swirling flecks of silver, as if the night sky had been captured in her gaze. For a moment, those eyes were unfocused, lost in the haze of pain and disorientation. Then, slowly, they sharpened and fixed on him. Her body tensed, instinctively pulling away, but she winced in pain, her hand reaching for her side where the glowing wounds were still healing beneath the bandages. "Easy, easy," Tom said, raising his hands in a calming gesture. "You're hurt. I'm not going to hurt you." Her gaze flicked from his face to the bandages on her body, then back to him. Confusion lingered in her eyes, but there was something else too. Relief, perhaps? She seemed to recognize that he had helped her, even if she didn't understand why. "Human?" Her voice was soft, barely a whisper, the word wrapped in an accent that made it sound foreign yet elegant. Tom nodded. "Yeah, you crash-landed out there in the desert. I found you." She winced again, her brow furrowing in thought as she tried to piece together what had happened. Her hand drifted to her side, fingers brushing the bandages. "You saved me?" Tom gave a half-smile. "You didn't give me much of a choice, couldn't just leave you there." There was a pause as she considered his words, her gaze studying him carefully. She was clearly weighing whether to trust him, but there was no hostility in her eyes, only curiosity and perhaps a bit of wariness. "I am indebted," she said after a long silence, her voice gaining a bit of strength. "You should not have interfered. It is dangerous, for you." Tom frowned at that. Dangerous how? Her gaze darkened, and she glanced toward the open desert as if expecting something or someone out there. "My people, they do not tolerate rebellion. I am marked." Tom's eyes narrowed. "Rebellion?" She nodded weakly, taking a slow breath. "I am Zara of the House of Cyrex. My father rules the Galactic Confederacy. I defied him, and now I am cast out." Her voice trembled slightly as she spoke the words, a mixture of pride and sadness in her tone. A princess. Tom wasn't entirely surprised. There had been something regal about her, even in her weakened state. But the idea of an entire galactic empire casting her out to die in the desert, it made his blood boil. "Cast out to die, huh?" Tom muttered, shaking his head in disbelief. "Hell of a way to treat your own family." Zara lowered her eyes, her expression tight with pain, though whether it was from her wounds or her memories, Tom couldn't tell. "I knew the risks when I opposed him. I thought I could change things, but I was wrong." Tom leaned back, his mind racing. The situation had just gotten a whole lot more complicated. A rebellious alien princess, abandoned by her people, and now on the run? It was bad enough he'd stumbled into this, but now he was bound to her in some unspoken way. "Well, you're not dead yet," Tom said finally, his voice firm. "I'm not letting them finish the job either. Whatever's coming, we'll deal with it, together." Zara's eyes widened slightly at his words, as if surprised by his willingness to help. But after a moment, her expression softened, a hint of gratitude flickering in her gaze. "You are different," she said quietly, her voice laced with wonder. "Humans are not known for their kindness." Tom chuckled. "Guess I'm not most humans." Zara's recovery was slow but steady. Over the next few days, Tom made sure she was well fed and rested, keeping a close watch on her as she healed. He helped her walk again, though she was stubborn about regaining her strength, pushing herself harder than he would have liked. In their downtime, they talked, and Tom learned more about her world. The vast empire of the Galactic Confederacy, a rigid hierarchy ruled by power-hungry leaders like her father. Zara had tried to stand against the oppressive system, speaking out for the oppressed and challenging the military's violent ways. It had made her enemies, even within her own family. "They called me a traitor," Zara explained one evening, her voice low and bitter. They sat under the open sky, the campfire crackling softly between them. "My father believes loyalty is absolute, and any who oppose him deserve no mercy." Tom shook his head, disgusted by what she had endured. "So he just left you to die in the middle of nowhere? That's how he deals with rebellion?" "Yes," she whispered. "He feared me, feared what I represented, a challenge to his rule." Tom's hands tightened into fists. He couldn't imagine the cruelty it took to abandon one's own child to a fate like that, but he knew all too well the nature of power and control. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice soft. Zara looked at him, surprised by the empathy in his tone. "You understand," she said quietly, studying him. "You've seen war too, haven't you?" Tom nodded, though he didn't elaborate. His past was full of scars, battles fought in faraway lands, but those memories stayed locked away, too painful to share. Still, there was a silent understanding between them. Two souls forged by conflict, both fighting against forces larger than themselves. As the days went on, Zara grew stronger, her alien physiology speeding up her recovery. Her wounds had nearly healed, though the deeper emotional scars still lingered. She no longer had a home, a people. The Galactic Confederacy had turned its back on her. But as she spent more time with Tom, a new bond formed. What had started as a necessity, his care for her and her need for survival, had become something more. She admired his tenacity, his willingness to protect her, even though he owed her nothing. One night, as the stars shimmered overhead, Zara broke the silence between them. "You didn't have to save me. Why did you?" Tom stared into the fire for a long moment before answering. "I've lost enough people in my life. Didn't want to add another to the list." Zara's gaze softened, her heart stirring at his words. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "for giving me a second chance." Tom looked up, meeting her gaze, and for the first time he saw something in her eyes that went beyond survival, something deeper, more personal. It was a connection, fragile yet undeniable, forged in the fires of hardship and shared struggle. "You're welcome," he said, his voice steady but soft. As the fire crackled between them and the desert wind whispered through the night, they both knew that whatever came next, they wouldn't face it alone. They were no longer just a soldier and a princess. They were allies, partners, perhaps something even more, and the galaxy was about to find out just how strong that bond could be. Zara's strength had returned with remarkable speed. Her wounds, which once glowed with a strange alien energy, had healed, leaving only faint scars that shimmered in the moonlight. Though her body was recovering, her spirit was restless. Tom could see it in the way she moved, her sharp gaze always flicking to the horizon as if expecting a threat. She had the bearing of someone used to fighting, used to running. One evening, after another quiet meal by the fire, Zara stood and stretched, her alien physiology already restoring her grace and power. She turned to Tom, her violet eyes intense. "You've helped me regain my strength, but I need more than that. If I am to survive what comes next, I need to be ready to fight." Tom looked up at her, knowing what she was asking without her needing to say more. She was a warrior, one who had been betrayed by her own people, and now, more than ever, she needed to hone her skills, to prepare for the inevitable confrontation with those who had cast her out. "All right," Tom said, rising to his feet and wiping the dust from his hands. "But if you're going to train with me, you need to be ready for human tactics. It's different from whatever you learned out there in the stars." Zara raised an eyebrow, a hint of amusement in her expression. "I've fought in battles across entire star systems, human." Tom smirked. "And you've crashed into the Nevada desert. Seems like there's room for improvement." Zara's lips twitched, the closest thing to a smile he had seen from her. "Very well. Show me your ways, Earthman." What followed was a rigorous regimen of training, blending Zara's advanced alien combat techniques with Tom's military experience. Zara was fast, incredibly agile, her movements almost fluid, like a predator in her element. But she lacked the discipline that Tom's years in the service had drilled into him, the patience, the precision, the ability to assess a threat before striking. They sparred daily, their bodies glistening with sweat under the unforgiving desert sun. Tom taught her how to fire earth weapons, explaining the importance of conserving ammo, aiming carefully, and knowing when to hide versus when to strike. Zara, in turn, showed him the close-quarters combat techniques used by her people. Swift, brutal maneuvers that were as beautiful as they were deadly. At first, their sparring matches were intense, both of them pushing each other to the limits. But gradually, something shifted. The competitive edge dulled, replaced by a growing sense of trust. Tom realized that this wasn't just about teaching her how to fight, it was about forming a deeper bond, one built on mutual respect and shared experiences. One afternoon, after a particularly grueling session, Zara collapsed onto the ground, breathing hard. Tom sat beside her, the two of them staring out at the endless desert. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the dunes. "You're good," Tom admitted, wiping sweat from his brow. "Better than I expected." Zara glanced at him, her expression softer than usual. "You're not so bad yourself, for a human." Tom laughed, a deep, genuine sound that seemed to catch Zara off guard. For a moment they sat in comfortable silence, the weight of their pasts forgotten, at least for a while. "You've been through a lot," Tom said quietly after a long pause. "But you're not alone anymore." Zara's gaze softened, her violet eyes reflecting the fading light of the sun. "I know," she whispered. And for the first time in a long while, I believe that. The peace they had found in each other was short-lived. On the 7th night after their sparring began, Tom was out collecting water from a nearby spring when he spotted it, a glimmer in the sky, barely noticeable against the stars. It was small, moving fast, and heading directly toward their camp. His military instincts kicked in immediately. That wasn't a meteor, it was a reconnaissance drone. Tom raced back to camp, his heart pounding. Zara, sensing his urgency, was already on her feet, her alien senses heightened. "We've got company," Tom said grimly. "Galactic, by the looks of it." Zara's expression darkened, the calm that had settled between them vanishing in an instant. "They've come for me." Tom's mind raced. Whoever had sent the drone wouldn't be far behind. Zara's people had clearly been tracking her, waiting for the right moment to strike. He had known this day would come, but not this soon. They weren't ready. "They won't attack right away," Zara said, her voice sharp and focused. "They'll wait until they're sure I'm here." Tom nodded. "We've got a few hours at best." Together, they packed what little they had and moved into the shadows of the nearby canyon. The rocky outcrops would provide some cover, but it wouldn't last long once the real hunters arrived. As they set up a new temporary camp, Tom laid out the few weapons they had: 2 rifles, a handful of grenades, and a combat knife. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. "We'll have to outsmart them," Tom said, his mind already working through possible tactics. "We can't take them head-on." Zara's eyes flashed with determination. "Then we'll fight from the shadows, like you've taught me." They worked through the night, setting traps, and using the natural landscape to their advantage. Zara's knowledge of galactic technology allowed them to predict how the enemy would scan the area, while Tom's experience in guerrilla warfare gave them the edge in positioning and timing. By dawn, they were ready, or as ready as they could be. As the first rays of sunlight crept over the horizon, the sound of engines echoed across the desert. Tom and Zara crouched in the shadow of a large rock formation, their eyes locked on the incoming ships, sleek black vessels with the unmistakable insignia of the Galactic Confederacy. They hovered ominously, scanning the ground below. "They're here," Zara whispered, her voice low and steady. Tom's grip tightened on his rifle. "Stay close, we'll make them regret coming." Zara's gaze flicked to him, and for a brief moment there was something unspoken between them. A silent acknowledgement of what they were about to face together. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about protecting each other. As the ships began to descend, kicking up dust and sand, Tom and Zara braced for the fight of their lives. The odds were against them, but they had something the enemy didn't: each other. And in that moment, as the battle loomed ahead, they knew that whatever happened, they would face it together, warrior and princess side by side. The Galactic Confederacy ships hovered menacingly above the desert, their sleek black hulls glinting under the early morning sun. Tom and Zara watched from their hidden vantage point, bodies pressed against the cool rocks of the canyon. The ships landed silently, their hatches hissing open, and out stepped a squad of heavily armed soldiers, their exoskeletal armor reflecting the deadly efficiency of their purpose. "They won't give us a chance to run," Zara whispered, her voice tight with urgency. "These are elite hunters. My father must be desperate to end this." Tom nodded, his face hard with determination. "Then we don't run, we fight." They had spent the night preparing the terrain, turning the natural formations of the canyon into a deadly maze. Now, it was time to spring the trap. As the soldiers fanned out, scanning the area with their advanced sensors, Tom took a deep breath and signaled Zara. She gave him a curt nod, and together they moved into action, silent as shadows. The first soldier passed beneath them, unaware of the thin tripwire stretched between two boulders. A faint snap was the only sound before the explosion detonated, sending a cloud of sand and debris flying into the air. The soldier's armor shielded him from the worst of it, but he was thrown off balance, crashing to the ground. Before he could recover, Zara descended from her perch on the rocks above. With lightning speed, she disarmed him, her alien strength and agility overwhelming his high-tech defenses. In a flash, she brought him down with a strike to the base of his neck, the impact incapacitating him instantly. Tom, meanwhile, had positioned himself higher up the canyon. He took aim with his rifle, picking off another soldier from a distance. The armor was tough, but he had learned to aim for the gaps, those tiny weak points where the armor didn't fully cover the joints. His shot hit true, and the soldier collapsed, his weapon clattering to the ground. But the rest of the squad quickly regrouped, their scanners now detecting the heat signatures of their targets. Tom and Zara had lost the element of surprise. "Move," Tom shouted, rolling behind a boulder as a barrage of plasma fire scorched the rock where he had been moments before. Zara ducked behind a ledge, her sharp eyes scanning for their next move. "We need to separate them," she called out, her voice calm despite the chaos around them. Tom knew she was right. These soldiers worked best as a unit, and if they stayed together, Tom and Zara didn't stand a chance. They needed to divide the group, confuse them, make them vulnerable. "Cover me," Tom ordered, and without waiting for a response, he darted out from cover, firing his rifle to draw the attention of the soldiers. Immediately, 3 of them turned, chasing after him as he sprinted deeper into the canyon, away from Zara. Zara took the opportunity, leaping from her hiding spot and engaging the remaining soldiers with a fury that matched the desert's heat. Her movements were a blur of speed and precision, every strike deliberate, every dodge calculated. The soldiers, though heavily armored, couldn't keep up with her agility. One by one, they fell, disoriented and overwhelmed by her relentless assault. But they weren't finished yet. Tom led his pursuers into a narrow pass, his mind racing. He could hear the heavy thud of their boots behind him, closing in fast. He slid behind a rock outcrop, pressing himself flat against the stone, and waited. The soldiers advanced, their weapons scanning the area, cautious now that they knew their prey was more dangerous than they had anticipated. Tom's heart pounded in his chest as he calculated his next move. He didn't have the firepower to take all 3 of them head-on. He needed to even the odds. With one quick motion, he activated the grenade he had rigged to a nearby pile of rocks and tossed it into the path of the soldiers. The explosion rocked the canyon, sending boulders tumbling down the narrow pass. 2 of the soldiers were buried under the rubble, their suits crushed under the weight. The third, though injured, managed to leap out of the way just in time. Tom gritted his teeth and charged, taking advantage of the confusion. He collided with the remaining soldier, knocking the plasma rifle from his hands. The 2 of them grappled, fists and elbows flying as they struggled for control. Tom's military training kicked in, and despite the soldier's advanced strength-enhancing suit, Tom fought with the sheer force of survival driving him. With a powerful knee to the soldier's midsection, Tom broke the grip and spun the alien around, pinning him to the ground. A quick, precise strike to the back of the soldier's helmet left him unconscious. Tom stood, panting, surveying the wreckage. 2 soldiers buried, 1 incapacitated. He wasn't out of the woods yet, but the odds had shifted in their favor. Back at the main battlefield, Zara was locked in a brutal duel with the leader of the squad. He was taller and stronger, his armor gleaming with insignia that marked him as an elite warrior of the Confederacy. But Zara was faster. She darted in and out of his reach, her strikes landing with surgical precision. "Is this what you've become, princess?" the leader sneered, blocking one of her blows. "A fugitive, fighting for your life in the dirt?" Zara's eyes blazed with fury. "I fight for freedom, something you'll never understand." With a final, devastating strike, Zara disarmed him, sending his weapon flying across the sand. She didn't give him a chance to recover. In one swift motion, she brought him to his knees, her arm locked around his throat in a deadly chokehold. "You were wrong to come here," Zara hissed, her voice low and dangerous. Tell my father if he wants me dead, he'll have to come himself. The leader gasped for air, his pride wounded more than his body. Zara released him with a shove, and he collapsed in the sand, defeated but alive. Tom appeared behind her, his rifle slung over his shoulder, his eyes scanning the horizon for any more threats. "You all right?" he asked, his voice rough from the exertion. Zara nodded, her chest heaving from the fight. "I'm fine." Together they stood over the fallen soldiers, the desert winds whipping around them. They had survived, but they both knew this was only the beginning. More would come. The Confederacy would not give up so easily. Tom turned to Zara, his eyes meeting hers in a moment of quiet understanding. They were no longer just fugitives, no longer just survivors. They were warriors, and they would fight for each other, no matter the cost. "This isn't over," Tom said, his voice steady. "No," Zara agreed, her gaze fierce. "But we're ready." The battlefield lay quiet now, the bodies of the fallen soldiers scattered across the desert, their gleaming armor dulled by sand and blood. Tom and Zara, weary from the fight, moved quickly, gathering whatever they could salvage from the wreckage. Plasma rifles, tactical gear, anything they could use for the next confrontation. They both knew this was only a temporary victory. The Confederacy would soon realize their squad had failed, and more forces would follow. As Tom secured the equipment into their makeshift camp, Zara sat on a nearby rock, watching the horizon. The desert, with its vast emptiness, felt more claustrophobic than ever. She could feel the weight of what was coming. "They'll send more," she said quietly, her voice carrying over the stillness of the desert. "And they won't make the same mistakes." Tom glanced at her as he finished inspecting one of the plasma rifles. "They underestimated us. That's their first mistake." Zara looked at him, her gaze intense but filled with something unspoken. "You don't have to do this, you know. Fight them. Fight my battle. You've already saved my life." Tom stopped what he was doing and met her eyes. "This isn't just your fight anymore, Zara. They came after us both. And besides, you think I'm going to let you face this alone?" She was silent for a moment, the vulnerability she rarely showed slipping through her usually stoic expression. "I've been alone for a long time. Until now." Tom walked over and sat next to her. "Not anymore," he said quietly. "Whatever comes, we face it together." Zara's eyes softened, the hard edges of her defiance melting away for just a moment. She had spent so much of her life fighting, against her father's rule, against the system that sought to destroy her spirit. But here, in this moment with Tom, she didn't feel the need to fight anymore. At least not with him. "What happens if we can't stop them?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Tom looked out at the vast expanse of the desert, the same desert that had once felt like a prison to him, but now seemed like the only place that made sense. "We don't think like that," he said, his voice calm and certain. "We'll find a way. We always do." Zara studied him for a moment longer, then nodded. "Then we prepare." They spent the next few days turning their temporary camp into a fortress. With the advanced technology they had scavenged from the fallen soldiers, they set up makeshift defenses, rigging traps, and placing motion detectors in the surrounding area. They practiced combat drills, honing their strategies and preparing for whatever the Confederacy would throw at them next. But in the quiet moments, when the sun dipped low in the sky and the desert air cooled, they would sit together, exchanging stories of their pasts. Tom shared fragments of his life before the war, of the people he had lost and the battles that had hardened him. Zara, in turn, told him of her homeworld, once a place of beauty and peace, now a fractured empire under the iron grip of her father. They were different in so many ways, from worlds separated by galaxies. Yet, the more they shared, the more they realized how much they had in common. Both warriors, both outcasts, both fighting for something bigger than themselves. And in those quiet moments, something deeper grew between them, an unspoken bond that neither of them could fully explain, but both felt undeniably. The storm hit just before dawn. Tom awoke to the sharp beeping of one of the motion detectors. His hand instinctively reached for his rifle as he bolted upright. Zara was already awake, standing at the mouth of the canyon, her eyes fixed on the distant horizon. "They're here," she said, her voice tight with focus. Tom joined her, peering through the scope of his rifle. In the distance, dark shapes moved, sleek and silent, creeping closer with the precision of trained hunters. This time it wasn't a small squad, it was an army. They brought more than I expected, Tom muttered, counting at least 24 soldiers, along with hovering drones and larger armored vehicles. They won't make the same mistake twice, Zara said, gripping the plasma rifle she had claimed from one of the fallen soldiers. They've brought heavy artillery. Tom's mind raced. They had planned for this, but the scale of the attack was greater than either of them had anticipated. We stick to the plan, he said, his voice steady. We hit them from the shadows, use the terrain to our advantage. Zara nodded, her violet eyes narrowing with determination. This is our last stand, isn't it? Tom glanced at her. Maybe. But if we go down, we're taking a lot of them with us. As the first wave of soldiers moved into the canyon, Tom and Zara took their positions. They had rigged explosives along the narrow paths, knowing the enemy would funnel through them. As soon as the soldiers were within range, Tom detonated the first charge. The explosion rocked the canyon, sending debris and bodies flying into the air. But the Confederacy soldiers were relentless. The survivors regrouped quickly, advancing with disciplined precision. Drones hovered overhead, scanning for heat signatures, and Tom knew they would find them soon. Zara took out 2 soldiers with rapid, precise shots from her plasma rifle, her movements fluid and deadly. Tom fired from his position higher up in the rocks, picking off the advancing troops with calculated efficiency. But for every soldier they dropped, 2 more seemed to take their place. They're closing in? Zara shouted, ducking behind cover as a burst of plasma fire scorched the rocks beside her. Tom cursed under his breath, reloading his rifle as quickly as he could. We can't hold them off forever, he muttered. We need to lure them deeper into the canyon. Zara nodded, understanding immediately. Lead them into the traps. I'll cover you. With a final glance at her, Tom took off, moving swiftly along the ridge, drawing the enemy's attention. Plasma bolts whizzed past him as he ducked and weaved through the rocks, heading toward the narrow pass where they had set the last of their explosives. Zara, meanwhile, provided cover fire, her shots precise and lethal. She moved like a shadow, her alien agility making her nearly impossible to target. The Confederacy soldiers hesitated, unsure of how to deal with her swift and unpredictable attacks. As Tom reached the final trap, he paused, turning to see the soldiers converging on his position. His heart raced as he waited for the perfect moment, his hand hovering over the detonator. Come on, he muttered, his eyes locked on the advancing troops. Then, just as the first wave entered the kill zone, he pressed the button. The explosion tore through the canyon, the shock wave sending soldiers and debris flying in every direction. The air was filled with the sound of collapsing rock and the screams of the injured. For a moment, everything was chaos. When the dust settled, Tom and Zara regrouped, standing amidst the wreckage of the battle. The canyon was littered with bodies and broken machinery, the once pristine desert now a graveyard. But as they surveyed the aftermath, a low hum filled the air. Tom's heart sank as he looked up. A massive Confederacy ship hovered above them, casting a dark shadow over the canyon. Reinforcements. Zara's face was grim, her eyes fixed on the ship. They won't stop, she said quietly. They'll never stop. Tom's grip tightened on his rifle. Then we don't stop either. As the ship began to descend, preparing to unleash its next wave of troops, Tom and Zara stood side by side, ready for the fight of their lives. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The massive Confederacy ship loomed overhead, casting a dark shadow over the canyon as it began its descent. The rumble of its engines reverberated through the ground, a warning of the overwhelming force that was about to be unleashed. Tom and Zara stood side by side, their eyes locked on the approaching threat, knowing this would be their final stand. Zara glanced at Tom, her violet eyes fierce but filled with something more, an unspoken connection they had forged through their shared struggle. If we're going to do this, we need to hit them hard, fast, and without hesitation, she said, her voice steady. Tom nodded, his jaw set. We've got one shot at this. We can't let them corner us. As the ship's landing gears extended, a hatch opened and soldiers began to disembark. This time, it wasn't just the elite troops they had faced before. Massive war droids followed, their heavy metal frames stomping onto the desert floor, their weapons bristling with plasma cannons and energy shields. Tom's heart sank as he realized the scale of what they were up against. but there was no turning back now. He exchanged a glance with Zara, and in that moment, they both knew that whatever happened, they would face it together. "Ready?" Tom asked, gripping his rifle tightly. Zara nodded, her face determined. "Let's give them a reason to remember us." With that, they moved into action. Zara darted forward, her alien agility allowing her to slip through the barrage of plasma fire with ease. She took out 2 soldiers with well-aimed shots before vanishing behind a rocky outcrop, drawing the enemy's attention away from Tom. Tom, meanwhile, moved to higher ground, taking aim at the approaching war droids. He fired at one of the machines, but its energy shield absorbed the hit. Cursing under his breath, he quickly switched tactics, targeting the legs. His shots hit their mark, and with a grinding sound of metal, the droids stumbled and collapsed, sending a cloud of dust into the air. But the Confederacy forces kept advancing, their numbers seemingly endless. Plasma fire rained down around them, forcing Tom and Zara to retreat deeper into the canyon. They were running out of time and options. "We can't hold them off like this," Tom shouted over the chaos. "We need to take out that ship." Zara's eyes flicked to the hovering vessel, its engines glowing ominously. "It's heavily armored," she said, "but if we can disable the engines..." Tom's mind raced. "There's an old fuel depot in the next canyon. If we can lure them there and detonate it, we might have a chance." Zara nodded. "But we'll need to draw them in close." Together they devised a plan. Zara would continue to engage the soldiers, keeping them occupied, while Tom made his way to the fuel depot and rigged the explosives. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot they had. "Stay safe," Tom said quietly, his eyes meeting Zara's. She gave him a faint smile, her hand brushing briefly against his. "You too." With that, they split up. Zara moved like a phantom through the battlefield, striking swiftly and retreating before the enemy could react. Her alien strength and speed were unmatched, and for a moment it seemed like she was holding back the tide single-handedly. Meanwhile, Tom made his way to the fuel depot, his heart pounding as he worked quickly to set the charges. Every second felt like an eternity, the sounds of battle echoing in the distance. He could only hope Zara was holding them off long enough. Finally, the charges were set. Tom activated the remote detonator and sprinted back toward the canyon, the weight of the moment heavy on his shoulders. When he reached Zara, she was fighting off 3 soldiers, her movements a blur of deadly precision. Tom raised his rifle and fired, dropping one of the soldiers with a clean shot. "Go," he shouted, pulling her toward the canyon. Together, they ran, the Confederacy forces in hot pursuit. Plasma bolts whizzed past them, and the ground shook as the war droids stomped after them. But they didn't stop. They couldn't. As they reached the mouth of the next canyon, Tom glanced at Zara. "Now." He hit the detonator. The explosion rocked the desert, a massive fireball erupting from the fuel depot. The shockwaves slammed into the Confederacy forces, engulfing the soldiers and war droids in flames. The ship above them shuddered as the blast wave reached its engines, and with a deafening roar, the vessel careened to the ground, crashing into the canyon with a thunderous impact. For a moment, everything was still. Then, as the smoke began to clear, Tom and Zara stood side by side, breathing hard but alive. The once imposing Confederacy forces lay in ruins around them, their ship a smoldering wreck in the canyon below. The battle was over. The Confederacy had been defeated, at least for now. Tom and Zara stood atop a ridge overlooking the destruction they had caused. The desert, once a place of desolation and danger, now felt like something else entirely, like freedom. Tom wiped the sweat from his brow and looked over at Zara. She was covered in dust and sweat, her once pristine appearance battered by the fight, but there was something radiant in her eyes, a spark of hope that hadn't been there before. "We did it," Tom said, his voice filled with disbelief and relief. Zara nodded, her gaze still fixed on the horizon. "For now." Tom knew she was right. The Confederacy wouldn't stop. They would send more soldiers, more ships, and one day they would come for them again. But for the first time, that didn't feel like an overwhelming burden. It felt like a challenge they were ready to face together. Zara turned to Tom, her expression softening. "You've given me something I thought I'd lost a long time ago," she said quietly. "What's that?" Tom asked, his voice low. "Hope," she whispered. "A reason to keep fighting." Tom met her gaze, the unspoken bond between them stronger than ever. He had started this journey as a loner, a soldier without a cause, but now with Zara beside him, he felt like he had found something worth fighting for. "Where do we go from here?" Zara asked, her voice laced with uncertainty. Tom smiled faintly. "Wherever we want," he said. "As long as we're together, we'll figure it out." Zara looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. Together. They stood in silence for a while, watching the sun set over the desert, casting long shadows across the wreckage. The battle had been won, but their journey was just beginning. They were no longer just a human and an alien princess. They were partners, allies, and perhaps something more. As the stars began to emerge in the night sky, Tom reached out and took Zara's hand. She looked at him, her violet eyes shimmering in the fading light, and smiled, a rare, genuine smile. For the first time in a long time, they both felt like they were no longer running from something. They were running towards something new, something unknown, but something full of promise. Together they turned and walked into the night, ready to face whatever the galaxy had in store for them. Their fight was far from over, but now they had each other. And that was all they needed.